We're going to start the sessions on the enabling public-private partnerships in the clean energy in Southeast Asia. I'm going to present the speakers and also the materials that they're going to speak about. The first speaker is Mr. David Elzinga, Principal Energy Specialist in the Energy Sector Operation in Southeast Asia. David has been working in the sustainable energy and climate fields for 20 years with a focus on technology development, deployment and finance policy and analysis. He is now leading the Energy Transition Mechanism, an ADB flagship initiative to accelerate retirement of coal-fired power plant and unlock greater investment for clean energy. David will talk about the status updates on the ETM activities, including the pilot transaction of private sector coal-fired early retirement under ETM. Our second speaker is João Aleluia, energy specialist, also works in the energy sector operation in Southeast Asia. João has worked in energy sector for more than a decade, and he is now covering Cambodia sector operation. João will share with us an example of ADB sovereign lending with sector development program modality in Cambodia, focusing on energy transition. Our third speaker before the Q&A sessions is Rajiv Ralhan, who is a partner with PwC India. Rajiv has over 23 years of experience in advising public sector as well as private sector clients. He has worked on areas like developing energy efficiency policy for appliances, building decarbonization, transport decarbonization, and sustainable cooling. So Rajiv will also share with us about the challenges and opportunities of energy efficiency in ASEAN. Without further ado, I'll start this session, and I would like to welcome Mr. David Elzinga on the stage to present his presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and pleasure to be here. It's fantastic to be at ACEF for the first time live again after a number of years of being on virtual. And so today I'm going to talk to you about the Energy Transition Mechanism, an initiative that's being led by the Asian Development Bank in partnership with a number of developing member countries. And I know that maybe some of you have heard about this and some of you have not, so I'll try to strike the right balance of providing, a comprehensive picture, but at the same time trying to get into some nuance and things that I consider interesting as both an engineer and a development professional. I look forward to any questions you may have, and I'll leave it to Chitra to manage that. So let's see. Good, it's working. So why are we looking at accelerating the retirement of coal-fired power plants? I think traditional development work and clean energy work has been more focused around looking at how do we get more renewables and other clean energy technologies into the system. And if we take a look at the share of coal-fired power generation, we see in some countries or regions that it's beginning to drop. But then when we look at both Asia and on a global basis, it actually has remained quite flat over the last number of years. We see, both demand for electricity growing, and at the same time, coal is continuing to be deployed. And so if we really want to decarbonize the energy system, we're not suggesting in any way that we need to stop doing renewables or other clean energy technologies, but rather we need to also try to look at existing power generation and thermal, especially coal, and try to find ways to accelerate its exit from the power system so that we can really bring the shares of clean energy much higher. Do I need to start over? Okay, good. For your benefit, I don't. Okay, next slide, please. So what does it look like? I think when people often talk to us about accelerated coal retirement, there's a range of things that people talk about. They say, oh, you're going to shut it down tomorrow. And I don't think that's practical. And while I'd appreciate that from reducing emissions in the power sector, we have other considerations. So if you look at the left-hand side of we see an energy system that has demand on the top. The green represents the clean energy, and the coal plants in the brown below are the bars are individual plants that have been commissioned and are going to operate for a period of time. When we look at the energy transition context with the energy transition mechanism, we see that the plants continue to operate, but for a much shorter amount of time. So this is more about a managed phase out of coal from power systems rather than an immediate. Now, so of course, the benefits to that, it reduces the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. It can allow for additional demand for clean energy investments. And over the long run, it's going to reduce the cost of power in the energy system. But doing it in a managed way allows for investments in transmission and distribution themselves, but also allows us to deliver just transition activities. So those people and communities that depend on the coal power plant for their livelihoods have time to transition to new opportunities. Now, again, when we look at this, by making investments, any investments in the power sector, it's not just a technical issue. It's not just a financial issue. It has to be have a broad approach. And I think when we talk about accelerated coal retirement, especially, we really have to consider these elements carefully. And we talk about this for ETM in a 4P approach, and that's people, policy, power, and partnership. So on the people side, that goes back to the just transition element that I just highlighted. And in that respect, we want to make sure that we understand what are the impacts and what are the mitigation measures. So if we close a coal-fired power plant, there are a number of people that will lose their jobs in the plant, but it also will have an impact on the community itself. Reduced, say, machinists or other operators that would support the operation of that coal-fired power plant. What are the opportunities that for additional jobs? That could be new energy production, say through renewables, but that also could be developing other industrial applications that can provide jobs and livelihoods for people and communities. On the policy side, policy has a huge impact as to how fast and as well in what way clean energy technologies can be built and created in different power systems. So we are very much looking at this from analyzing the existing policies in the countries we're working in and making recommendations on how these can be adjusted to accelerate the transition. And this is part of ADB's bread and butter that we have been doing for many years, but framing this a little bit differently, as we used to very much focus on access to energy aspects. Now that in many countries, the access to energy is very high, that we can start shifting to that transition away from fossil fuels to clean energy. On the power system, we indeed see electric power as both a social and an economic good. Disruptions to power supply have huge impacts, and outages, the cost of outages are actually hard to calculate, but very high, and also start to impact negatively the business environment. How can people put their businesses in an area that doesn't have a stable supply? And of course, the other aspect is cost. We have to make sure that as we support this transition, that we try not to impact the cost of electricity, because again, this has impact on people and businesses. The last and most important part, I would say, is that this has to be done in partnership. As a development bank, we invest on average around $5 billion a year in the energy sector across Asia. And that's a big amount of money for someone like me. But when we look at the actual need for energy investment in just the Asian region, it's many, many, many times larger than that. So we need to be partnering with governments, with international finance institutions, philanthropies, private sector actors, NGOs and CSOs, a whole range of actors in order to ensure that we're all working together on this energy transition. And of course, one of the most, or I think the most important actor is the country themselves. How do they see their energy transition going forward, and how can we align to support that? Next, good, thanks. So now I haven't talked actually much about what we're doing or how we're doing this, and I'll get more into those details as I go forward. I've been trying to set up the broader picture first, but let me highlight some of the actions that we're doing. I'll highlight first off. We talk about the retirement or repurposing of coal-fired power plants. That is one part of it. And the reason we use both retirement and repurposing is that in a number of the countries we're working in, especially I'll say Philippines and Vietnam, the supply and demand of power is quite tight. So if we want to talk about retiring a whole bunch of coal plants, many of the power sector stakeholders will say, whoa, we need this generation to keep our system going. And that's where we talk about repurposing. For ETM, we're not talking about coal to gas. That doesn't really align with our energy policy. That may happen as part of the plans of the country, but we're very much focused more on very low carbon solutions and the shift from fossil fuels to renewables. The other part I want to emphasize that I may not talk a lot about the investments in clean energy or the investments in renewables, but indeed that is an important part of this and the other side of the coin. One of the reasons we focused very much on the accelerated retirement or repurposing is that this was largely a gap in the broad energy transition story. We've been working on renewables, grids, storage, energy efficiency for many years. I think many of us as professionals in the sector, and in that respect, this accelerating coal retirement was a gap, and that's why we put a lot of focus on this area. The next point I want to make again is just to highlight that the just and affordable transition needs to be part of this. And we engage very much with the NGO and the CSO community. It's great to be part of an organization that takes that engagement really seriously, and it's quite uncomfortable from time to time. We get challenged very much to make sure that we deliver this in a way that really provides benefits to the environment, but also to the community. And I'm really glad to be part of ADB that can engage on that level. Going to the diagram at the bottom, we've created the ETM Partnership Trust Fund, or we call it the ETM PTF. And that's a way for us to talk to governments and philanthropies and see if they want to provide us with resources that we can then invest in a range of different ways. And that's, we talk about our ETM fund or vehicle. That would be what we hope to eventually create and scale up this work. Direct ADB transactions. We're working on a number of loans and specific transactions that can demonstrate the ETM process. And of course, a lot of work on technical assistance. We need to do the analysis. We need to work with different partners in our countries to bring that capacity forward. And this can all go eventually into creating that environment and actually doing those transactions in coal retirement and also in clean energy. So for where we're at today, we've been working since about early 2021. We started with a pre-feasibility stage and are now in the feasibility stage at different points across the three main countries we're working on, of Vietnam, Indonesia, and Philippines. But we're also starting early work now in Pakistan and Kazakhstan. And in our feasibility study in these three countries, we see a range of areas that we're looking. Again, it doesn't map exactly against that 4 Ps, but largely touches on that as well, where we look at project selection, which is very much a technical perspective, but as well also involves engaging with owners of plants to see if they want to work with us on ETM type approaches. The actual transaction structuring and financial analysis, what we're seeing is a range of different models that are needed and different approaches depending whether it's a portfolio of coal plants owned by one company, if it's public versus private, there's different approaches that are needed. And I'll actually get into that in a little bit more detail. We're looking at the possibility of a ETM fund vehicle that we can scale this up. So we're starting to work on that now to see what is possible. What is the appetite from the investment community to support something like that? And then lastly, environmental, social, and governance aspects. And this includes as well the just transition aspect. Next slide, please. So I'm gonna, oh, I need to do that. Well, next slide, please, because it's where, there we go. I'll just highlight a few things that we are looking at a range of different models. It is not a one size fits all. We started with the approach of trying to buy plants so that we could retire them early, but we actually shifted more to what we call the synthetic model. And in this respect, plant owners, existing owners can choose to be part of, stay with the plant and be part of the transition story. So we can do a financial transaction that can reduce the life of the plant, but the owners stay the same. I think, and actually we're looking at a combination of both. Some may want to divest, as in, so they divest their shares to someone else, and some may want to stay in. We can actually combine those models when appropriate. And then the last one that we are investigating is a portfolio model. And this would be a sustainability linked loan or a sustainability linked bond structure that can then allow a corporate to retire a number of plants and then receive support based on actually meeting those retirement goals. The other part I want to talk about the transaction structuring and financial analysis is looking at a carbon methodology for CFPP early retirement. And my colleague Chitra will take any of the hard questions on this if you have any later, as this is her expertise and not mine. And she can also correct stuff if I get it wrong. But effectively, when we look at the top graph, which is the baseline, these are the emission reductions that would happen without a project. And in that respect, it's going to operate along its life. It's probably going to increase in its emissions as it goes older. When we look at a project structure, once we retire that plant, it will have, we will stop the business as usual and go forward from that point. And you'll see 2 points there on the bottom graph. You have the emission reduction from early coal retirement and project emissions. That's the remaining emissions from the project. And in that respect, that can be the replacement power of generation once the CFPP is retired. But it also, we could consider if the grid would be used to provide that power, because it would have a base level of emissions as well. So it's not as simple as saying you retire it and then you have zero emissions. The principles behind carbon methodologies always have to be conservative, and therefore that is where that bottom figure goes. And again, I'm happy for Chitra to provide much more details on that. The other part I want to talk about, again, that fourth part on the environmental and social governance. And this is a very complicated slide. I expect that these will all be given to you. So the key point I want to make here is, if you look at that, the circular diagram instead of circles, it's like an onion where you have the asset level, the community level, the subnational level, the national level, and the regional level. Making the transition from coal to clean energy is going to have an impact across all these levels. When we look at a transaction, we will largely focus on the asset level and the community or district level. That's where we believe we have an area of influence and can provide some support to those people and communities that depend on that coal plant. We are currently assessing that with one of our first transactions to see what are the impacts. And then the next point, of course, is how do we mitigate them? But then we are also working with, especially firstly with Indonesia looking at the subnational level and the national level to see what programs and support can be put in place. I'm excited about Just Transition because all the countries that we work in as ADB all want to grow economically, all want to provide jobs. We're just making sure that that's one part of the Just Transition to make sure that's included in our work. Want to highlight the other key area that we're doing is we call it SESA, which stands for Strategic, Environmental, and Social Assessment and Stakeholder Engagement. This is a key aspect that we want to highlight with respect to ETM. These are changes to communities, and even if we believe that these are positive changes, we do need to make sure we engage with the community and understand what are the concerns, what are the needs for them, and how can we bring them along while we make these decisions. Even a good decision, if it's made for me, without my consultation, I might not like it. We have to take that same attitude when we try to make interventions around a coal plant, around and any project, even developing clean energy. Make sure that we engage with the people in the community that will be affected by this so that they can manage this, and hopefully this will support them in a positive way. And if impacts aren't positive, how do we mitigate them again? Every investment that's made in the energy sector does have an impact on both the environment and on people who are around that. So how do we make sure that we do this in a fair way? I think this is one of my last slides. Not going to go through this in detail, but I just want to highlight that Indonesia is where we've made our most progress with. It's been just such a pleasure to work with the Indonesian government and Indonesian stakeholders who have really taken this Just Transition on board, especially during their leadership of the G20, as well as this year's chairship of the ASEAN. In that respect, we have a range of programs, and that goes to my earlier point that it's not just one solution. It needs to be part of a comprehensive energy sector analysis, and we're working on that at this point. In the Philippines, it's a bit different, different market structure, much more privatized, and then also the election that happened last year has created a bit of delay. But we're really encouraged that the government has come on board and right now is really increasing their engagement in energy sector development. And then lastly on Vietnam, and similar to the Philippines, in Vietnam, there is a very tight power supply and demand, and therefore we really need to analyze very carefully, how do we support this transition while ensuring that there is adequate supply and as well keeping the costs manageable. So let me close with this slide, and very much look forward to any questions or comments I have when we do Q&A later. And in that respect, we're excited to be part of the ETM as a way to say, how do we fill this gap? How do we help stop doing the things that we don't want to do, keep doing all the good things we want to do to help countries transition from fossil fuels to clean energy? Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. I would like to, first of all, greet all members in the audience. So on my presentation, I will provide you an overview on how Cambodia has started its transition to cleaner forms of energy. And let me start with a bit of context, first of all. And for that, I will go back in time a few years to 2016, so that you can have an idea on how things have evolved since then. 2016 was also, let's say, a watershed moment for us as ADB, because we sort of stepped up our engagement with Cambodia when it comes to energy sector operations. So in 2016, Cambodia was experiencing a very rapid expansion of its economy. It was growing at around 7-8% year on year. In fact, this growth rate only came to a halt with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the implications of this massive expansion, very quick expansion of the economy, is that the demand for energy, and more specifically for electricity, was ballooning. So in a period of just 6 years, from around 2010 to 2016, the demand for electricity increased threefold. And even though, starting from a relatively low basis, I think this is a massive increase for any standard. And there were other drivers for this growth in demand for electricity. One of them was the increase in electrification. In 2016, the electrification rates were around 60%. 10 years before, it was around 10-12%. So there were a number of new connections to the grid. As you can see in the slide that you have on the right-hand side, this is how how demand was met. This is the power generation mix, domestic mix in Cambodia. And as you can see, the bulk of this generation capacity was met by hydropower and coal. And except for hydro and a little bit of biomass, there were no other renewable energy resources being developed or being harnessed for the production of electricity. And even though we don't see on that slide, around 20% of the demand for power in Cambodia was being met through imports. And this was a dependency that was increasing. So this dependency on imports and also on an imported fuel, coal, was leading to very high, relatively high end user power tariffs. Cambodia had, and still has, although it has been improving since then, has some of the highest end user power tariffs in the whole of ASEAN. They are the second highest. So as you can see, these were some of the challenges that the country was facing when it comes to the energy sector and power sector. So what we did to start with, we, together with the Ministry of Mines and Energy, in collaboration with them and also with the National Power Utility, EDC, one of the very first things that we did was to look into the, sorry, can we go a bit back? Let me see. So one of the very first things that we did was to look into the potential for solar. And the reasons for this are that Cambodia has some of the most abundant and richest solar resources in the whole ASEAN. They are also very well distributed. And the cost of the technology were also coming down significantly, already back in 2016. And solar also has enabled some flexibility in deployment because it enables, modular and relatively quick implementation. But as you could see from my slide before, in 2016, there was no solar PV capacity installed. So what we did was we worked with the Ministry of Mines and Energy and with EDC in the preparation of a solar master plan and roadmap that identified priority areas for the development of these solar resources. And for that, we looked into the resources that had the highest potential, the proximity of those resources to injection points in the grids, and also their proximity to load centers. This solar master plan was very important for future developments of solar in Cambodia. And it was the basis for us, for example, to select a location to develop the first national solar park in Cambodia for a capacity of 100 megawatt. So this was a project that was developed with the technical and financial assistance of ADB. It was very unique and innovative in several ways. And in particular, it was the first public-private partnership project in the power sector involving a renewable energy technology to be developed in Cambodia. And under this model, the public entity, in this case EDC, the state-owned enterprise, They have invested in the solar park infrastructure by providing land, substation, and also a transmission line from the solar park to the national grid, while IPPs, independent power producers, were invited to submit bids to install and operate the solar plants themselves. And this was done in two phases. Phase one was for 60 megawatt, phase two for 40 megawatt, as you can see in the left-hand side of the slide. And on the right-hand side, you can see the impacts of allocating this capacity as part of a tender process. So you can see the evolution of solar tariffs since 2016. 2016 was actually the first year that a solar grid-connected solar PV facility was commissioned in Cambodia. It was at the end of that year, was for a 10 megawatt plant, and the tariff that was agreed was of 9.1 cents per kilowatt hour. 2 years later, there was an IPP that signed on a bilateral basis a PPA for 7.8 cents per kilowatt hour. And then you can see at the end of that graph the tariffs that resulted from tendering out to the private sector as part of a competitive auction, phases 1 and 2 of the National Solar Park. And this led in both phases to the lowest procured prices for grid-connected solar power in the whole of ASEAN. So we have shattered the record on both occasions. And you can see with this example how renewable energy resource, in this case solar, can be or could be cost effectively developed in Cambodia for the generation of power. So the solar PV roadmap and the National Solar Park tender catalyzed the rollout of additional solar PV projects. And at the end of last year, solar PV accounted for around 13% of domestic generation capacity. And taking into account that in 2016, at the beginning of 2016, there was no capacity, solar capacity, this was a quantum leap for Cambodia. And you can see on the left-hand side the locations that were prioritized for development of solar parks, and the locations of the projects on the right-hand side that were developed later stage, and that you can see that they roughly match. So, so this was one of the dimensions of the energy transition taking place in Cambodia, the adoption of solar, of an abundant, bountiful, renewable energy resource, and we were very happy to have contributed to this. Another dimension of the energy transition is the adoption of energy efficiency. Can we go back 2 slides, please? That's another dimension, which was one slide before. That was another dimension that was somewhat overlooked by the government, as a bit much as in other jurisdictions, but no longer. The government of Cambodia realized and understood that there was an untapped, significant untapped potential for energy efficiency. 2 years ago, ADB conducted a study that identified demand-side energy efficiency opportunities in Cambodia. And one of the findings of this study was that energy savings of around 12.5 terawatt hour could be achieved with adoption of energy efficiency along a 10-year period. And with this study, we also identified what would be priority sectors, priority interventions that could be more impactful. So the question really is how to realize this energy efficiency potential. And well, this is a long journey, as those who have worked on energy efficiency know, that requires the development and enactment of policies, of regulations, their enforcement and compliance, and also investments on energy efficiency need eventually to take place by both the public and the private sector. Cambodia is still at early stages of this journey, but last year it took an important step in this direction with the approval of the national policy on energy efficiency. It was approved at the end of last year. One more policy document that ADB had the pleasure to provide technical support. I could say a lot about this policy, but I just want to emphasize, highlight a couple of points. This policy sets a national target for the reduction of total energy consumption in at least 19% in relation to a business as usual scenario by 2030. And this target is then broken down for different sectors, for industry, for the residential sector, for transport. And this policy identifies a set of measures, mechanisms, and instruments that will be prioritized to instill the implementation of those energy efficiency measures in Cambodia. So energy efficiency is another key component of the energy transition taking place in Cambodia. At the same time, Cambodia, and even before the development of the national policy on energy efficiency, Cambodia embarked in development of their first long-term and comprehensive power development master plan, covering a period of around 20 years. ADB provided technical assistance in the preparation of this very ambitious policy document. You can see there the objectives of the plan. They don't differ that much from similar exercises taking place in other countries for plans of a similar nature. I just want to jump straight into one of the main outcomes of the PDP, and that is the scenario that was adopted as reference by the government for developments in the power sector, is one that maximizes the expansion of renewable energy and energy efficiency. And you can see the targets on the right-hand side of the slide, renewable energy targets that have been set with this plan for renewable energy generation and installed capacity. And all of these targets go far beyond what Cambodia had committed up until that moment as part of the NDC and the long-term strategy on carbon neutrality. So clearly Cambodia has been upping the ante and the ambition. And you can also see on the left-hand side the volume of investments that need to be mobilized to implement this plan. Just to give you an idea, around 9 billion, even more, US dollar during this 19-year period. So clearly, Cambodia is taking initial, but I would say firm steps towards a clean energy transition. So in addition to having committed to more renewable energy, more energy efficiency, there were two important commitments made by Cambodia. One was not to develop any new coal-fired power plants beyond those projects that had been already committed to a few years before, and also no large hydropower developments in the mainstream Mekong River. As you know, these are projects bound with very complex environment and social safeguards implications. So the government also committed not to develop any big development in the mainstream Mekong. These were the basis for us to develop, along with the Ministry of Mines and Energy, what we have named very aptly, I think, an energy transition sector development program. This slide provides an idea of the concept of this program at a very basic level. For those who are not familiar with ADB lending modalities, under this sector development program model, ADB agrees to provide a loan for a combination of policies with project investments. On the left-hand side, you can see the policy component of the program. So the idea here is that ADB agrees to disburse a loan that can be used, in the treasury for the government, for the national budget, upon government approval of a set of pre-agreed policies. In this case, policies that support the energy transition. So this part of the program was for a total of 50 million US dollar. On the left-hand side, you can see the project investment components that complement the policy part. And these consist, first of all, of a demonstration scale battery energy storage system that is being implemented by the National Power Utility, EDC. And this is for a funding volume of 24 million US dollar. And the second project investment component is for investments on more energy efficient street lighting devices. And it is being implemented, will be implemented in two small cities in the south of Cambodia named Kap and Kampot. And this is also a project that will fulfill a demonstration purpose. And this one is for a volume of 3 million US dollar. and the Ministry of Public Works and Transport is the implementing entity. And you can see at the bottom of the slide the different financing sources for this program. So concessional resources were used from ADB, from the Green Climate Fund, and also from the Climate Investment Fund. So this is the idea of the basic concept of the program. Here you can see the policies that were compiled as part of the policy component. We have structured them in 3 areas. I will not go deep into this. It's just for you to have an idea of the policies adopted by the government supportive of the energy transition. I could go one by one if you were interested, but I will let that for the Q&A if there is an interest. On the project investments, very quickly, the battery energy storage component is for, let me see. Okay. Sorry, a bit too much. Yeah. So the battery energy storage component is for demonstration scale facility with the capacity of around 50 megawatt hour / 50 megawatts. It will be installed in the same location of the National Solar Park project. It will complement a smaller pilot project that is also being financed by ADB, but EDC is developing a battery energy storage cluster on that location. And there are 2 main functions of this system. One is to provide energy storage services during peaks of excess capacity, and will also provide ancillary services in the form of frequency regulation. And with these services, the investments in the power system expansion will be deferred, both in terms of generation capacity and the transmission. So a very quick overview on the battery energy storage part. On the second investment component, so the investments on more energy efficient streetlights will have a replacement component. HPSV luminaires will be replaced by more efficient LEDs, and we'll also correct boom angles in these interventions. We'll also have greenfield installations. An important component of this project is that we expect the local economy to benefit from this, because these are small cities that depend a lot on tourism, and they have night markets and local businesses that operate at night. So by expanding the streetlight coverage, the opportunities for improving the economic standing of these small businesses and creating more jobs will be enhanced. So what you have seen was the first phase of that program. We are now designing the second stage of this sector development program. Similar concept, combination of policies with the project investment components. For the project investment components, we are scoping out, we are focusing on 2 opportunities that we identified last year. One is on the setup of what we call an energy efficiency revolving fund that would provide low interest loans to SMEs for investments on energy efficiency. And the second would consist of interventions in public buildings, in this case in public hospitals, with the introduction of green building designs and interventions, which of course would include energy efficiency retrofits, possibly rooftop solar, and so on. Very quickly, okay, so all of this is still under development. We are scoping out the second phase of this program. In terms of the policies that we are now supporting the government, so the National Policy on Energy Efficiency provides the overarching framework. We usually say that now the hard work starts, because now Cambodia has to develop the regulations that will lead to the enforcement, that will instill a change in the market. So what we are focusing is on the preparation of a sub-decree and specific regulations for the introduction of minimum energy performance standards and labels for electrical appliances like ACs, like refrigerators, and so on. And it's not just about these specific regulations, but also the standard operating procedures, the guidelines that will make these regulations implementable and enforceable. So this is the area where we are focusing now, supporting the Ministry of Mines and Energy in Cambodia to improve the policy framework. This is one of my last slides. I just wanted to provide you a very quick overview of this concept of an energy efficiency revolving fund. So this is basically financial intermediation mechanism that is quite apt to jurisdictions like Cambodia that have markets with low to medium maturity that still needs some support to demonstrate the commercial viability of investments on energy efficiency and so on. So the basic idea here is that concessional resources of ADB would be transferred, would be lent to a government institution, which would act as a project implementation unit, which you see there, PIU, which would then on-lend these resources to what we call participating financial institutions. This could be commercial, banks operating at the retail level that would then blend these resources with their own and then provide low interest loans to SMEs for these investments on energy efficiency. And could also go a bit beyond energy efficiency, could be solar rooftop, other measures similar to that. And this would be for tenors of, let's say, 6, 7, 8 years. And then this one reimbursed, these funds could rotate for at least 2 or 3 more times and be reused again for other loans. And then therefore the concept of revolving fund. This is a very basic illustration of this concept. So this is something we are developing and we hope that we'll be able to pull this out. I just want to finalize my presentation with a couple of concluding remarks. First is that the energy transition can be embraced by low and middle income countries such as Cambodia. So this is not something exclusive of high income countries. And this can result in opportunities for economic growth and job creation. That example, that project investment on improved street lighting infrastructure, I think it's a good example of that. And also governments play a key role in creating the enabling conditions to support the transition towards cleaner forms of energy and thereby reduce the risks for investors. They are very important in the enactment of supportive policy, setting ambitious and realistic goals, and also supporting keystone projects and increasing access to finance. I think that Cambodia provides very good examples on this. The Power Development Plan, the National Policy on Energy Efficiency, they have very tangible goals and they are ambitious. And I think the National Solar Park is also a good example of a keystone project that was supported from the very beginning by the government, and that can instill transformation. That's all from my side. Thank you so much. I'll be very happy to take any questions at the end. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Rajiv. Pleasure to have this presentation discussion with you. Okay, so why I'm here, I think one of the discussion points which was given to me was creating enabling conditions for increased private and public sector investments into energy transition in Southeast Asia. So the intent of my presentation is, I think we heard David talking about this whole idea around coal phase out, one component of energy transition, and then Jao maybe just sharing with us one success story from Cambodia, where different set of actions, how maybe they are joining together to achieve one goal, which is the energy transition. So I'll share my experience about that, maybe how I foresee energy efficiency playing a key role in this energy transition, and how do I see role of private sector. So one part is the policy side of it, and one part of it is how do I see the role of private sector in taking forward this agenda. So what are the contents? Maybe I'll briefly talk about key energy efficiency initiatives. We've been fortunate to work, we of course many regions, but primarily in the last 5 to 6 years in Southeast Asia. So have good exposure to field level conditions, have good exposure about the capacity building requirements, the market status, and what needs to be done. So maybe I'll be sharing that experience. Then the other part is maybe I'll briefly touch upon one of the key components, which is harmonization. Although in this presentation, I talk about harmonization of standard and labeling program. But larger, if we look at the larger intent, if we look at the larger regional cooperation, it's more about that if we harmonize different actions, if we harmonize our thought process, if we harmonize our learning process, I think as a region, maybe we can do much more. So I'll briefly touch upon S&L and maybe that can be adopted for other sectors. And the last part is I'll touch upon how do I see the role of ESCOs or energy service companies or different private sector stakeholders. So I'll not go deep into this slide. Maybe we have seen many studies, we have seen many publications, we have seen many research papers. The key message here is if you see, if you're talking about energy transition, energy efficiency is one of the key pillars. Because my topic is energy efficiency, so I'll focus more around that. And many countries, they have recognized that. For example, in Europe, the European Commission, when they are talking about their approach towards energy transition, the first pillar they have is they talk about energy efficiency. The second pillar which they have is they talk about the renewable energy sources. And the third pillar which they have is introduction to new fuels, where you talk about hydrogen and other things. So that's why somebody has rightly said that energy efficiency is a first fuel if you have to talk about energy transition. And in Europe, it is called energy efficiency first principle, which is integrating energy efficiency into all the decision-making process when you're talking about all the new developments. You all are from Southeast Asia, and of course, I see many participants from other countries also. So no need to explain the intent. Joe covered it, David covered it, that maybe the demand is increasing. Some countries have maybe committed towards net zero, and reliance on fossil fuel, it is clearly visible. So that's why it's a huge opportunity for all of us, maybe to devise simple actions, take step-by-step approach, and maybe achieve this agenda. So the message from this slide is, if you see this, these are the 4 themes maybe which are being discussed in many countries. People are talking about ESG. People are talking about net zero transformation. Cost optimization is one key agenda which is being discussed by businesses. And then people are talking about integrating smart things or digitization of whole process. And if you see all these 4 pillars, the key theme here is they all revolve around energy efficiency. So these are the sectors which are critical for our energy transition: industry, buildings, appliances, transport, and of course, we need to address the financing issues, and of course, we need to talk about demand side management issues. I looked at maybe some numbers maybe here and there, but the message from this slide, if you see, many countries, all the maybe Asian countries, they have set different set of energy reduction targets. So if you see, some countries, they have targets for reduction in their energy intensity, and some they don't have any target. Similarly, if you see in terms of reduction in total final energy consumptions, many countries have set different set of targets. More or less, if you see countries, if you look at the baseline of say 2005, average it is maybe close to 30%. Many of the countries, they don't have intermittent targets. So one part is setting the targets. The second part is developing an action plan. So do we have a linkage between targets and action plan? That's one critical question which we need to answer. And that's what maybe Zhao addressed in his presentation when he talked about the Cambodia story, where ADB, the government with ADB's support, they have taken small steps. They're not jumping into advanced set of ambitions. So what they did, first part is the market assessments, what is the potential. The second part is everybody recognized that there is a need for a policy instrument if we have to talk about energy efficiency, which is approved by the government. The third part is coming out with initial set of regulations on standards and all that. And there is an action plan for next 5 years, how things can be taken forward. So if we talk about all these countries, if we maybe want to achieve a larger result, we need to have a kind of a harmonized approach. We need to have a clear implementation plan so that maybe we can achieve the desired result. We also looked at that what is the status of energy policy in different countries in terms of do they have energy efficiency policy or act? Do they have provisions for mandatory energy audits for designated energy, DEC is designated energy consumers? Do they have appliance standard and labeling programs? Do they have building codes? Do they have ESCO energy service companies? ESCO is energy service companies. Or do they have a certification system in place? And if you see, maybe Singapore is maybe leading in maybe all the segments, but all the other countries are at different stages of adoption. So if you talk about the ESCO market, that column is more or less maybe evolving in most of the countries. So when you talk about private sector participation here, it's important that maybe we develop that kind of policy framework that we can achieve these results. So what are maybe, I think that there's a lot of text here. This presentation would be shared with you, but the whole idea of this slide is it talks about some of the energy efficiency initiatives undertaken by different countries. For example, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, and Indonesia, they have taken lead in promoting energy efficiency in building, industry, and transport sectors. Of course, appliance is one part of that. They also have maybe plans, mechanisms, maybe to provide incentives, or maybe they have plans to support the E in other segments. In terms of reporting, sustainable reporting or ESG guidelines are becoming common in Southeast Asia. That's another dimension which maybe we all need to take into consideration. So that's why maybe, for example, reporting is mandatory in Singapore. Malaysia applies to all the public listed firms, and Hong Kong, it's again mandatory. Philippines, it's voluntary at this stage. So with the time, it is becoming mandatory for all the entities maybe to report their actions, and that's why maybe actions around energy efficiency and other things are very important. A lot of work on building side is happening in Singapore. Many of the countries, they have identified industries as high energy consumers, and they have designated them as designated energy consumers. So that's where maybe some countries have set targets for maybe their consumers also, and some countries, they have started programs around vehicle fuel efficiency as well as electric vehicle adoption. So one part is I talked about the status in different countries. So if we have to move forward with the ambition of energy efficiency in these countries, one of the action points which is considered very critical is the appliance standard and labeling programs. Many countries have recognized this. And if you see this assessment, if we look at potential energy saving in Asian countries, if they go for MEPS, which is minimum energy performance standard, or they go for ambitious plan for energy efficiency, the saving could be as high as 25%. And these are some of the maybe saving potentials in different countries if maybe they adopt a minimum MEPS scenario as well. So one of the actions which is happening at maybe Asian level is that there's a regional harmonization program which is being maybe initiated by UNEP and maybe many stakeholders, including ADB. Maybe we plan to strengthen this whole idea that if we have to achieve larger results, if we have to achieve maybe better trade, if we want to have larger set of socioeconomic benefits, it's important that we harmonize our actions. Through this exercise, maybe one of the action point is to harmonize test standards, compliance mechanisms with different countries so that one set of actions are recognized by all the countries, but lot needs to be done. There is a plan also to create a common registry of all the products available in these countries, and so that maybe countries they have access to what kind of efficiencies are available and they can improve their policies as well. So if we have to do a harmonization in ASEAN countries, these are the 6 set of actions which we feel which needs to be undertaken. Harmonize the test standards. Can we create a shared database? But this is not applicable to only standard and labeling. In future, we can talk about other segments also. Can we identify a mechanism that testing done in one country is recognized by other country as well, rather than maybe we all invest a lot of money on creating that infrastructure? Can we have a common market surveillance program? Can we develop a common product registry? And how can we harmonize minimum energy performance standards or energy labels? I understand that for each country, the label is different because each country looks at its consumer base and devise their labels. But maybe we can think about that, but ultimately the performance standard, can we harmonize that? I think that is one of the action point which we all are considering. Okay. Next, please. Okay, I think this was at the end. I don't know why it's showing here. Okay, so how do we enable private sector investments in E? Although my focus is more around, slides focus more around energy service companies. But the way I see here is manufacturers have a big role to play if we talk about energy transition. So if we create an ecosystem where, because we don't have the capacity, we don't have the capital to create research and innovation facilities. Lot of information comes from the organized global manufacturers. So how do we make sure that in our policy framework, we create a mechanism there where maybe all the private players see value in contributing, see value in sharing their innovation agenda, see values in sharing their results. And I've seen globally that private sector is one of the key, I'll say, knowledge bank for the public sector to devise policies. So in many of the advanced policies, if you see private sector, their research professionals, they are part of the committee members, and without their vested interest, they contribute in developing the policies. So when I talk about private sector participation, one part is how do we make it bankable, efficient for private sector ESCOs to invest. But the other part is how do we engage the private sector so that they participate? They help us improve our policies rather than we only, as a public sector, we only do it. So these are some of the actions which I have laid down. For example, the approach, the Cambodia approach, can we start with clear set of policies? Step 1, step 2, step 3. Can we build this institutional capacity? If we have to take forward this energy efficiency agenda, capacity is a key. Can we raise awareness, provide technical assistance? Financing, we all talk about financing. Some people say there is no financing. Some people say there's a lot of financing, but how to do it? But how do we utilize these financing instruments is key. Encourage public-private partnership. So it's a both. So what we have to see here is that the private sector here, they are not here just for the social messaging. They have to earn money. Everybody has to earn money. So if we think about interest of all the parties, I think we can encourage a public-private partnership, which includes developing policies. Next, please. Can we demonstrate projects? Here, maybe I have a experience to share. If we are talking about putting these actions in place in all the countries, we need to have a policy instrument in place. Because we don't have policy instruments for ESCOs, for energy service companies, maybe we are not able to take forward that agenda. So I think the piloting is one clear part. I talked about regional cooperation And all these areas, I think I also talked about research and development. My message here is it is a role of all the stakeholders. Maybe we need to engage private sector here as well. Next, please. So these are some of the cases. What is the status of ESCO business in many countries: Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand? They have their ESCO mechanisms in place. They have some of the ESCOs accredited with them. So we have sufficient number here if we have to talk about taking forward this agenda. Next, please. So what are the key barriers here? Although I briefly touched upon the barriers, we need a legal framework. That's absolutely clear. I will not name the country, but we were working in one of the countries. Because there was no ESCO regulation, it was very difficult maybe to implement any ESCO projects. If you talk about PPP, PPP clearly defines that maybe what kind of projects qualify for that. And if there is no focus of energy efficiency in PPP projects, as per the government guidelines, we cannot do anything. For example, in one of the countries, street lighting could be tried under PPP because they use the word digital infra. So somebody has to find out a way that street lighting fits into infra. We are talking about smart street lights. Does that fit? But if we clearly define, if we address this issue, it becomes easy for the maybe all the players to invest in that. The second part which we realized is a barrier is, in many of the countries, when we talk about ESCO business, we say energy efficiency savings is a revenue. But in many countries, in their regulations, energy efficiency savings is not considered as a revenue. If they are not, the energy efficiency savings is not considered as revenue, whatever discussions we can have, how many capacity building sessions we can organize, nobody can do anything. And then there are other barriers, which is engaging different players, maybe the tariffs and all that. But for me, the critical part is if we address the regulation part, all the other parts can be addressed. Next, please. I'm left with 1 minute. Maybe so 3 slides. So in some of the countries, one way which is being adopted is, we've been talking a lot about energy service companies, private companies, public sector companies, super ESCOs. So one model which has seen some success is the super ESCO model, where, because there are some challenges for the private sector, a super ESCO could be a public sector ESCO, and they can demonstrate that, and specifically public sector can take a lead in demonstrating these super ESCO models, and then they can way forward for create a path for private sector companies. And super ESCOs can also build capacity of local ESCOs to take forward this agenda. Next, please. So these are some of the models, how super ESCOs work, how they work with different clients, how do they engage technology providers, how do they engage with private ESCOs. But so there are different models here. For example, this is one model. On the next slide, there's a model by Etihad ESCO. Yeah, next, please. So if you see this model, Etihad ESCO, they are investing in one facility and they are getting their money back from utility. So one critical part which needs to be addressed here is that how do we secure investments made by ESCOs? That is one clear part which requires, or the business models which we use. In this case, because there is a commitment from utility, it is easy for the ESCOs to invest, and there are agreed monitoring and verification protocols. So two last points from my side is, next slide, please. One is that if we have to secure, so we have to identify an approach which is simple. We have to start with deemed service models. It's very difficult when we talk about agreeing on monitoring and verification protocol. It is very complex here. So next slide, please. So these are some of the ESCOs. I will not go deep into this. These are some of the super ESCOs. Next. I think we already discussed this. Next, please. Yeah, last slide from my side. We have to, if we are talking about Southeast Asia, we have to start with simple actions. Can we have standard contracts? Can we go for deemed savings models? Once capacity is built, once we create sufficient infrastructure, and then maybe we see that maybe we can go for larger complex kind of agreements. So this is brief from my side. Thank you. Sorry, I took 1 minute more. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Rajiv, Joao, and also David for enlightening presentations. May I also request all of the speakers now to come on stage for question and answers? So I think from the presentations that we heard from the speakers, I would like right now to open the floor for the audience to raise your questions and also comments on the presentations that have been presented. So over to the, questions. Maybe you can cite your name and also the institutions where you're from before you raise your questions.
Thank you. My name is Kevin. I'm from the Indonesia Research Institute for Decarbonization, a think tank based in Indonesia. I have two questions regarding the ETM. First, will the JETP initiative incorporated under the ETM program, or it will be a separated program from the ETM? And secondly, whether the Presidential Regulations 112 of 2022 is sufficient enough for the ETM programs to be implemented. If it's not sufficient enough, then what would be further, what things that needs to be further regulated under the in the regulations framework? Thank you.
Great, thank you for that question. Yeah, with respect to ETM and JETP, I would say ETM will fit under JETP. ETM did some foundational analysis and engagement across Indonesian stakeholders, and is designing a number of different transactions that can support the energy transition. But I see JETP as being actually much more comprehensive and bringing together all the different stakeholders, both within the different agencies and government institutions, as well as some of the international community, into supporting the energy transition, and will deal with a number of different topics, including, say, local content concerns and other policy work. So I see JETP as actually much broader, but I really hope ETM brings some of those first transactions to create momentum and demonstrate viability of energy transition activities like accelerated coal retirement. With respect to Regulation 112, I would say it's hard to say yet whether it's enough. I think some of the pricing that is in the regulation is much improved compared to previous levels, but we do have to see how this plays out and if it is sufficient. And I reflect often on Vietnam and with respect to the regulations and the pricing that was put forward before the big build out of renewables, and many people said it's not bankable, and yet it was very much subscribed very well. So I think we need to wait and see. And on the requirement from the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources to create a coal retirement roadmap within the RE PERPRES. We're really looking forward to understanding that in detail to see how that fits in the broader energy transition work. And I think that will contribute to JETP discussions as that planning is happening right now.
David, even though I'm not the presenter, can I also add? So I think like to add to David's statement, the roadmap of the early retirement coal-fired power plant under PERPRES 112 will set a foundation for the future ETM work. And I think like if you also see the PERPRES, it also mentioned about the deadline or the timeline of the when all of the coal-fired power plant to be shut down, which is on in 2050. So I think it's already like a good start for the government of Indonesia to initiate, also to encourage ETM. And don't forget, under JETP, there will be a comprehensive investment and policy plan. And I think there's also like one of the triggers for the government Indonesia to have implementing regulations following the comprehensive investment and policy plan to implement the ETM. I think that's what I can add. Thank you.
I would say ETM under JETP.
ETM in Indonesia. Okay, other questions?
Can I ask one to the speakers? So energy, you both touched on energy efficiency, and I'd be just curious. This is a very high level question, but why is energy efficiency so tough? Because we always it's great to hear the progress and the work that you've described, but I often see it doesn't attract that same attention as, say, renewables deployment or battery storage. Based on your experience, why is that?
Honestly, maybe I don't agree with the question. So energy efficiency is not tough. Everybody is recognizing it now. It's more about that maybe we have to make people understand. Again, I'll take this example. If we could have energy efficiency policy in Cambodia, it's more about what I was saying in my presentation also. Sometimes we try to overachieve things. Depending upon the country, if we take simple actions, if we make people understand, I think these things can be demonstrated. So my experience in many countries, it's not tough, it's more about approach, which approach we adopt. Hope I could answer your question. Sorry, I'm an energy efficiency person.
Yeah, I can add to that, and also reflect a bit about our experience in Cambodia. I do think that one of the challenges is the lack of awareness. I mean, how big is this opportunity? That's the first question. And second, how can we realize those opportunities? And this, I think, links up with the second challenge that we are seeing already in Cambodia. When the adoption of energy efficiency, unlike, for example, the adoption of renewables, it's not about just specific projects, massive projects, but involves a lot the introduction of regulations, the standards that can set the level playing field. And you cannot simply stay or achieve at a place where you have the standard adopted. You have to enforce. You need to create the mechanisms to enforce. To be very specific, in the case of minimum energy performance standards, you may set the standard, you have the labels, but then you have to create the ecosystem for companies to register, to have their appliances tested. Then you need to have a system that will enable the government and also an ecosystem around it to do verification checks. So all of that requires capacity, requires time, and I think this is a challenge for implementation. Yeah, just some additional reflections on that. Thank you.
So we have this. Are these online questions? Okay. So we have 3 additional online questions. The first one, what are the specific policy reforms that was made for ESCO development, specifically that help them get finance from the banks? So I think this is addressed to Rajiv. That's your question, Rajiv. And then one question for Joao. What are the key driving for the very low Cambodia solar energy tariff offered by the IPP? And for how long is the PPA term? And for David, is there a control in place where the coal plant is retired in X numbers of years and not just transferred from one owner to another?
See, when you talk about ASCO policies, one of the critical thing which we have seen working in many countries is that the private sector, the industry is not sure that what is the capacity of any ESCO, because you're talking about engaging them for any work. That's one. So one process which we have adopted by many countries is that they have empaneled ESCO. So they have a process to scrutinize that, which includes financial turnover, experiences, in which category they fall in. So that's one way of doing it, that countries, they have put an empanelment process. A government, they have empanelment process where they say that this is this kind of ESCO, this categorize ESCOs, and they give the rating also. That's one part of it. And then many of the companies, what they say is they only invite the government empaneled ESCOs to participate in their bids. That's one part of it. The second part, which was I was referring to many of the countries here, was that because energy efficiency per se, the savings are not considered as a revenue. Okay. If that can be considered through a regulation, that helps many of the ESCOs to invest of these kind of projects. And the third part is more about creating business models, which I will not say that's a policy, but that's a set of business models which different ESCOs adopt to take forward this agenda. Yeah.
Thank you, Rajiv.
Thank you. On the question on why solar tariffs have come down so significantly with the National Solar Park project, well, there are several reasons. I'll try to focus on the main ones. The main ones were related to the way the project was developed, which I mentioned was in the form of a public-private partnership, where the risks of the project were allocated to the party best suited to take that risk. So, for example, the provision of land, availability of land. For an IPP, this could be a challenging aspect. So this risk of land acquisition was assumed by the National Power Utility, EDC. And the same thing with regards to the evacuation of the power from the site, from the land to the national power grid. So EDC, the National Power Utility, assumed that risk. So the IPPs, they had to assume the risks related to the construction and operation of the facility. And this greatly reduced the perception of those risks by the IPPs. So they could only, submit their bids for that specific part of the project. So this was the, in a nutshell, one of the reasons why, we got so many, actually we had many bids. So it was a dual stage, a reverse auction process. And there are also competition forces being harnessed. So there were many IPPs applying, and competition forces were in motion. And at the end of the day, the winning bidder was the one offering the lowest tariff. Yeah, that's it. Very quickly. Thank you.
Great, and thanks for the question on divestment. I think want to make one point very, very clear is that ETM is not only a divestment approach. It's an accelerated retirement approach. Previous ways that companies would say clean their balance sheet is they would simply take the asset and sell it to another operator. And there's a lot of dangers with this in that new operator may choose to operate it just as long or longer than the original operator had planned. And we've heard anecdotal comments that the new operator may switch off the pollution control equipment because that actually costs money, and they can increase the electricity production by not using that pollution control. So divestment strategies are good for the balance sheet, but have no positive impact on the climate or reduction of pollution. So with ETM, the owner may divest, but only divest in a situation where the new owner is going to take on an accelerated retirement or repurposing. And then secondly, in some situations, the sponsor or owner may continue to remain as the owner of the plant, but it's just a refinancing of the plant that results in decreasing of the life of the plant. I think both opportunities are fine, but I must say, I think it's great to see that some owners say, look, I invested in this plant. I'm going to stay till the end, but I'm going to reduce the life of the plant for the benefits of reduced emissions.
Before we go on a break, I still have one questions to David and one questions to Joao. So for David, for the energy transition mechanism, you have worked in 3 countries, pilot countries, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. And you mentioned that there's also growing interest in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So we know that there's some quite like advanced progress in Indonesia, but among the other countries, which countries that you think will follow Indonesia's steps and why? And for Joao, the question is like, right now, Cambodia is still significant. Well, the import of energy to in Cambodia is still quite significant. It's around 1/3 of their demand. So what do you think that ADB could support in helping Cambodia in meeting their improving their energy security?
Great, thanks, Chitra. I'll comment. So the 3 countries, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, and then Pakistan and Kazakhstan are the 5 countries we're actively working in right now. I'll comment, Pakistan, I think, is going to take a little longer. That's and I think it's just the economic challenges that they're facing as a country. This may be a very difficult thing to do right now. I'm most excited in the near term with Philippines. Under the new administration, we're seeing really an increased interest from energy sector and government stakeholders to really do more work in the energy sector, and that's traditional transmission and distribution. We're seeing the renewables auctions, and then we are having conversations around accelerated retirement as well. So I'm really excited about that and seeing that go forward. And then lastly, we do have other countries that may not have a programmatic approach, but there are actors who are who say own plants, and they are asking, oh, could we do accelerated retirement on this plant or this plant in the country? And the only thing we would caution about ad hoc approaches like specific plants is to make sure that as a country they are transitioning to clean energy already, because the worst thing we want to see is a transaction where we're accelerating the retirement of one plant and then they make a new investment decision on another plant. The countries we are working in who are active, like Philippines and Indonesia at this point, have made those commitments already to make the energy transition, and that's why this type of investment can work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chitra, for your question. 3 approaches very quickly that I would highlight. The first one is almost a no-brainer: more energy efficiency. So it's still largely untapped. So there's the first fuel. Second, the only resource that is abundant in Cambodia, energy resource, is renewable energy. Different sources: solar, a bit of hydro, although hydro development is constrained by water bodies in the Mekong, but solar is the major resource. There is even a potential to export overseas because it's so massive, the potential, that it is more than enough to meet the domestic demand. But solar needs to be developed alongside battery storage systems to balance the intermittency of the resource. And a third measure is that inverter-based resources, as we now call them, are developed. There is a need also to have the grid have the capacity to accommodate these new sources of power that are more fluctuating, that call for a more flexible and decentralized grid. So this is something that I think it's also very important that we're very keen to continue supporting Cambodia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, David, Joe, and Rajiv for your enlightening sharing on the energy transition in terms of enabling the public and private partnership in the transactions, policy actions, and also in energy efficiency. So great applause for the speakers. And now we go on a break before the next session. Thank you.
We have multiple routes to market for IPPs or new generators. We have regular power purchase agreements or PPAs. We also have retail electricity competition. So you can have a separate B2B retail electricity contract, or you can go to the wholesale electricity spot market known as WESM, which we are now this year very excited that all of the regions, all of the different grid systems are a part of WESM. So there are certainly major changes to come with full operation. It's also, because of the high tariff, a very exciting and interesting market for generators to come to. And if we can get the rules right, we think that we can really unlock reliability, security, and affordability here in the Philippines. Next slide. So this is just a summary. Some of the entrenched problems that we have been facing for years in the Philippines are now opportunities. We, like some of the other countries in Southeast Asia, have incredibly low electricity consumption per capita. This is because so many people don't even have access. So if we can get transmission system balance right, there's a huge growth opportunity. So a lot of interest for new businesses to come in. With the high prices, it obviously attracts a lot of folks to enter the market, and especially with the removal of the foreign ownership cap. The challenge we've had and have had for years is constrained transmission. About, what is it, 73% of all of our load sits on Luzon. But in order to unlock the demand in other regions, we really need to connect them and give them reliable electricity. For a long time, we've been locked into a single system, well, since 2008, since the concession agreement was signed. But the government is now looking at opportunities to change course, to try new solutions for transmission. It's not going to be easy, but I think we'll see major changes if we can have success in this area. The final point there is we have, since the passage of APIRA, the foundational energy law that privatized the system, had challenges with essential grid services or ancillary services. There's been mostly opaque bilateral contractual procurement of ancillary services that have been insufficient to meet our needs. But with the support we're giving to ERC and the rest of the government community to improve the transparency and competition in ancillary services, we think that we can really enable reliable electricity as well as more renewables to come onto the grid. Next slide. The government has been doing a lot to make this happen. First, the Renewable Energy Act of 2008 has slowly been implemented, but some important pieces are coming into play now. One is the Renewable Portfolio Standard. So every distribution utility around the country has to meet a minimum percentage of their electricity from renewable sources. So we're seeing renewed interest across the country there. We also have a new auction program sponsored by the government. This is a unique form of bankable PPA contract. Because it's coming from the government, there's not the same offtake risk as with other PPAs. They've also spearheaded a green energy option program. This is the ability to do a B2B relationship for retail electricity, another excellent option that we see increasing significantly in recent years. There's been a moratorium on new coal-fired plants, so that gives us a very strong baseline to build the renewables and storage. Very nice rules around preferential dispatch for certain renewables, tax incentives. There is a plan for renewables to build out the transmission grid to meet those renewables. And again, because the government's now thinking creatively about new solutions on transmission, there's an opportunity to finally reach that. And all of this falls under the umbrella of the nationally determined contribution, which sets ambitious goals on climate. Next slide. Now, the government is doing a lot. They are ambitious, and we want to support them. The way that we've organized our support to the government on policy issues is through the Climate Change Action Program. This is an umbrella policy reform framework that we're supporting the government on. It includes strengthening planning, financing, and institutional linkages for climate action, enhancing resilience to climate impacts. A lot of this is on food security. And then third, my area, strengthening low carbon pathways. So those are some of the policy reforms that we're driving. Last year. We had a flagship program signed with the government of the Philippines for 250 million with 150 million euro co-investment from AFD. And we're planning a second sub-program for 2024. And the government has already set out their ambitious goals of the policy reforms they want enshrined in that program. Next slide. Here is a little bit more detail on some of those policy actions that we are supporting the government to drive. Their priorities for policy reform. We're driving in several areas. But I'm just going to highlight two of those in this session because of the potential significance they have. One is the essential grid services. These are what are going to prevent the increasing black and brownouts that we're experiencing, as well as allow more renewables to come on board. And the second piece I'll talk about is offshore wind. And the reason that this renewable energy technology is important as compared to the many others, which are also important, is simply the scale. When you can talk about gigawatts, it's really game changing for the entire energy system. Next slide. I think I don't need to make the case for grid services, but sometimes it's difficult for people to understand when you don't have the backup frequency, contingency, reactive or black start services. That's when you get black and brownouts, and that costs people, it costs businesses an incredible amount of money, which means that we need to put money in to prevent that. The Philippines has seen significant improvement in the losses over time, but when you compare us to our peers, these are the simple measurements of reliability, the SAIDI and SAIFI measures for those who know them. We don't compare well to our economic peers, which means we need a change. There are many things that will change the needle for grid reliability. Depending on who you are, one might say that we need fewer unplanned outages from our large generation facilities, or you could say there need to be better penalties to hold these facilities accountable for unplanned outages. Our lack of transmission is a major inhibitor, or one could also blame the contractual relationship and incentives for transmission build out. But I'm going to focus on one smaller area, and that's just the deployment of ancillary services. We think there's opportunity to improve the definitions of what we're using in the Philippines, just to upgrade it to fit the energy context that we're in now, as well as instill approaches for transparent and competitive procurement of these services. Next slide. This is just a snapshot of some of the work that we are doing with ERC right now, looking at their existing definitions, their reasoning for them, and the many governing documents that need to be updated if we're going to update the definitions for frequency control, ancillary services, and the rest. Next slide. That's probably too much detail. Next slide. Sorry. So the next step is just to, after we improve the definitions, improve the approach to procurement. So again, we want to transition from what are currently done opaque bilateral contracts between the transmission system operator and those receiving the contract to a transparent and competitive approach. Now, these approaches are different for each of the services. So there's a major difference between what's needed for frequency control, which might be at the generation front. So making sure that governor control modes are enforced. Another ancillary service is contingency reserve. So we can have competitive systems for this. And in fact, the government is rolling out a reserve market, which is very exciting. It will look a little bit like the WESM, the wholesale electricity spot market, but be specifically for contingency services. And so on and so forth. So each of the services, we have to think about what makes sense from a fairness and competition perspective and procure the services separately and in a way that makes sense for each of them. Next slide. In addition to reforming the way that we're procuring services, we also want to make sure that the payment for them is fair. Right now, 100% of our essential grid services are charged directly to customers. We think that we can incentivize better behavior with generators as well as our transmission system operator if we're charging the potential violations for the ancillary services. Now, it doesn't work for all of our services because obviously you need enormous amounts of data points to be able to accurately pinpoint some of the services. But where it's possible, we're looking at opportunities to enforce a causers pay principle. In addition to that, we are looking at the current incentives that the transmission system operator has to deliver on ancillary services. If they're underperforming, are they being penalized for it? What are the simple contractual changes that could be considered if we want to incentivize better performance on ancillary services, which would mean a more reliable grid, which would mean better electricity service, as well as more renewables able to come onto the grid. Next slide. So we are taking a stepwise approach. Nothing can be done overnight. So we have a set of interim solutions that we're proposing could be done right away. And another set need a great deal more consultation with the industry and socialization before they can be adopted. So we're looking at a phased approach to implementation. But when we get there, even with step one, I think we'll see real improvements in terms of our reliability. So that's it on ancillary services. Next slide. I'll speak very briefly, very brief because I'm looking at the time, on offshore wind. There's a lot of excitement in the Philippines about the potential for gigawatt scale renewables. There are a lot of steps that are needed in order to deliver on such a big promise. Some of those are data, transmission planning and solutions, marine spatial planning, new approaches to offshore wind permitting. We don't have a way to lease out the areas outside of an energy provision lease. But I'm going to focus just on a couple of them that ADB is supporting. So the first is bankable PPA contracts through the GEOP, the Green Energy Auction Program, the regulatory framework for offshore wind. So how are we coming up with the gear prices, and targets and incentives based on comparative levelized cost of energy that fit into our generation mix here in the Philippines. I have to apologize for all the acronyms. I didn't screen the slides for acronyms before I put it up. Next slide. So very quickly, here is what we are supporting the ERC and the DOE on right now. First is looking at bottom-up costing models. So looking at the assumptions and really trying to localize as much as we can. We want to use this information not just for the requirements of ERC in order to meet the need of moving offshore wind forward in their regulatory steps, but we also want to take a broader look at the generation mix in the Philippines in general. If such a big promise of renewables requires investment from the government, it should be justified. we need to know that based on the LCOE, it makes sense to pursue support for offshore wind. So we're using the detailed bottom-up costing to look at the overall system for clean energy in the future and see where offshore wind fits into that, to come up with the kind of estimates of where the government might think to put resources at the scale that's needed for offshore wind. Next slide. So in addition to some of the regulatory framework pieces we're doing, we're also thinking about the transmission build out and some of the new solutions that the government is looking at. It's clear that we're stymied, and I'm so excited to work with government officials who are thinking creatively. And this work is still very early, so there's no solutions that I can share yet, but I'm very pleased that there is strong ambition and a willingness to break the logjam on transmission. Next slide. So that's it. Thank you all for sitting through some tough topics, at least on ancillary services and also offshore wind. But I'm very happy to share the ambitions of the government and the work we're doing to support them on these very big components of an affordable, secure, clean energy future for the Philippines. Oh, sure. Do you want to join? Any questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Diana. You can sit maybe on the phone.
Oh, sure.
Okay, so we will have 10 minutes Q&A session. Yes, very also comprehensive and technical in a way, so may take some time to digest. I guess you presented very well, Diana. Everyone understood. Very clear. There will be no issues, I guess, in the future Philippines electricity supply and reliability, I guess, with the clean energy. Okay, so maybe I give you more time, then we move to the next presentation and we'll have maybe a Q&A session at the end. Maybe we will have many commonalities between the countries, and really Diana set the scene very well, relate to the essential grid services that actually I'm going to talk about as well in the Vietnamese context. So I'll go ahead with the presentation on the Vietnam case, and then it's going to be followed by also the UNA presentation, the Timor-Leste cases that also comes with actually the combined technologies of the solar PV and the battery storage. And then we will have a Q&A session to for the all three presentation. Okay, so yes, now my timer is moving, so I can start my presentation. So battery storage, battery energy storage system development for Vietnamese energy transition. And then this is maybe, can you go back to the, yes, actually the photos that I put up in the first slide is basically to show this kind of future energy system. Energy transition, carbon neutrality is by 2050, that is actually committed by the Vietnamese government. Really make the transitions happens in a way that an energy system that is based on the fossil fuel that has to move to the renewable energy based systems. But it's not only the renewable like solar, wind, or the kind of geothermal or biomass or all the connections, but also there is additional new technologies has to come in to provide a reliable and stable electricity services. That's also one of the key technologies is going to be the battery storage. And also, of course, the pump storage hydro is become very now important, and it's likely to be also increasing in the region. But we see that the role of this battery storage as well as pump storage all together, and we'll go through these stories in the context of the Vietnam. Next slide, please. So before I go into the this particular topic, also like to show the Vietnamese power system overview. Vietnam is now the largest country in a way with the installed capacity amount in ASEAN region. Now they have 80 gigawatt of the scale, and then composed with various technologies. If you see that the trend in the past it used to be a hydro-based system, but in last 10 years, it become like a coal dominance, and then a move to the now renewable energy-based system very rapidly. Although the percentage at the moment or the share of the this renewable is still around 20%, but it's very significant in terms of if you think of the scale of the power system in Vietnam, and then also the pace that have made in the last few years. Next slide, please. Their Power Development Plan 8 was approved in May this year, and actually they presented very ambitious and then also pioneering kind of ideas in terms of achieving the carbon neutralities by 2050. Still maintaining power security to meet the very fast growing economy, and therefore the energy demand is going to be continued to grow, especially up to 2030, around 8-9%, and then afterwards they're going to be a bit more tailored. But to meet this demand, the scale of the investment as well as the power system to be added also is going to be kind of a quantum jump, and I will show to you a bit later on. Next slide, please. Yeah, it's a kind of busy slide. It's actually to look at this kind of composition of the power, fuel sources by technologies, and from now to 2050. And this is what actually the Vietnamese government have projected to meet this rapid growth of the electricity demand, but also to achieve the carbon neutralities by 2050. And they made this commitment to make the carbon emission peaking years as 2030, which is just 7 years later. And therefore, the no coal power generations and new coal power plant operation development after 2030. And then after 2050, then it's going to be no coal generations and fossil fuel generation. They basically map out the transitions of the existing coal and also the gas-based power plants to use also clean fuels such as ammonia and hydrogen, start from the co-firing and for the coming years, but it's moved to the full conversion by 2050. In terms of scale, if now it's around 90 gigawatt, and actually has to be double almost in the next 10 years. And then another 10 years, the system has to be doubled as well. So you can imagine the amount of the investment required and the pace of the development of this project to be followed to implement these visions of the government. In terms of the share of the renewables, and you see that the increase a lot in the solar PV in much later stage, because now their solar generation has been kind of saturated because of the transmission congestion issues and constraints. And so they promote more on the onshore wind, and you see a lot of increase in the coming years in the onshore wind. And afterwards, it's going to be the offshore wind actually to be a game changer for decarbonizing the electricity generation system. To meet this development and then also to under this power system fuel mix, and basically you need a kind of additional technologies such as the pump storage hydro and as well as the battery storage. And their target is by 2030 is going to be 2.4 gigawatt of pump storage hydro, and then also the 300 BESS. I just want to show that how fast actually renewable energy being developed in Vietnam. So start in 2018 with a feed-in tariff structure, then actually then 2019 They added around then 5 gigawatt of the 3 gigawatt of the solar, and then also they continue to be increased in terms of the rooftop solar, and another scale like 8 gigawatt in 2022, and the grid connected solar become like 9 gigawatt by 22 as well. On top of this, small hydro also been increasing. It has to be the major sources before as well, but they continue to increase up to the 5 gigawatt scale. Next slide, please. So what would happen actually with this fast growing renewables in the system? What kind of challenges have we experienced? So in Vietnam, in the last few years, there were issues in the congestions and also the difficulties in transmitting kind of the energy generations then being produced from the renewable like a solar in the central and the southern regions to the high demand growth centers in north. Traditionally, this is a Vietnamese map, and in basically the major power plants, especially coal, is located in the north, and then along with the hydro systems. The central is also some hydros, and then southeast is kind of gas-based generation system, and a lot of the renewable, like in solar, being added, also wind added in the central and southern region. Unfortunately, there's not this kind of strong and the transmission lines connecting the north to south, and because of the these constraints, and basically the congestions and the containment issues prevailed in the last few years. Next slide, please. And then also the overloadings of the substations and even distribution lines in the central and the south regions, and in some cases containment rate actually soared to the 6%. Some of the days and the period of the of last year and then previous years. And the problem is the congestion happens and overloadings happens in those regions, but the development pace of the transmission lines and substations have been slowed, and it's not be able to catch up the pace of the development of the renewables. Next slide, please. Another challenges I've seen, actually it's a very recent phenomena. Basically now Vietnam has experienced very severe power outage. It's just this month, actually beginning of this month, they start having this load shedding. They kind of lack of the powers in northern regions, 4 gigawatt. And then as I showed in the map, basically their power system in the north and central and south are not fully integrated in an optimal way. And therefore, this actually accelerated the problems. And also another issue is because of their hydro systems not really can provide the needed electricity because of weather. It's dry, and then also it's hotter, so the consumptions and the energy, use of the energy for air conditioner has been increased a lot. Northern regions actually is the area that a lot of the industrial factories are located as well, and then they now have to stop productions because of the load shedding schedules. Although Vietnam government tried to minimize the impact to the economy and then also the industry production, but still because of lack of electricity supply, that makes them actually there's no other options to switch off electricity. For the household, also buildings, and then also industry. It is actually combined with the multiple reasons beside actually the weather, and then also these constraint the transmission. There's a kind of malfunctioning of the coal power plants. It's being old. So it all combined actually, resulted in this outage. And then as Diana mentioned, this is going to cause a cost in the economy and the industry, and then the lost value is going to be is unmeasurable in a way. But this is an inevitable situation at the moment, and is likely to continue in the coming weeks. The thing is now, another observation that we have found is actually the congestion issues in the south and central region has been addressed, and because of the lack of the water in the hydro system. now their power system be able to observe and then use the renewables and solar generations to and then dispatch to the users. So problem is now is the power system grid is not really dealing with all the renewables, depending on the circumstance, hydro and systems versus solar, and the weathers and combinations, the demand increase, and then basically the different problems comes and go in different ways. But it's going to be continued unless it's properly addressed in fundamental solutions are provisioned. Next slide, please. So as a way forward, it's similar to the context as in the Philippines that really try to bring these essential grid services and create the reserve markets and bring in those services in place with a proper market mechanism. Same notions. Basically now the renewables have been coming into the systems, and it's just intermittent, and also the variant, and also it's going to be difficult control. And therefore, the power system requires the flexible resources that actually in all the segment of the power systems, from the generation, transmission, distributions. Besides, actually, also we need a separate storage systems. So these flexible resources are not only from these technologies, but also from the demand response programs or the electric vehicles that need to be integrated together in the power system. So now we have to look at the power system not as a conventional power system that actually in a big power plant generate electricity and transmit it to distribute it to the end users. We have to look at this. All the segments have a different combination of technologies for production and consumptions, and then also provide the needed flexibility resources to make sure that there is no the outage or the kind of the diminished reliability of the power supply. Next slide, please. And the battery storage is one of the kind of technologies that provide various grid services. It comes from the renewable energy integration perspective and providing the farm powers, combining with the solar or wind. Or it can be also provide the system operation kind of grid services such as frequency regulations, and then also the must-run kind of reserves services and etc. And then also on the transmission distribution side, also with the smoothing of the peak power by combining these best technologies, you can also defer the investment on the grid side as well. So it can be used on the investment deferral side as well. And this been utilized in many other countries, being also experiencing this type of the needs in a different segment, and then also different approaches been taken in terms of the providing incentives to induce this investment in the technologies. Next slide, please. So the key question now, then in Vietnam, so we need a flexibility resources. Where can we find this flexibility? In Vietnam system, also it's very traditional system. It's actually large scale thermal based and hydro based, and they connected the high voltage transmission lines, and being now added to the renewables, but they didn't have time to prepare the other kind of flexible resources, both demand side as well as supply side. The easiest way would be these best technologies to come on board and integrate it. But can it be invested in the energy market? The moments, like in the Philippines, they also have in the wholesale market, but they have a kind of price cap, and therefore their peak and off-peak prices are not sufficiently different to incentivize the kind of services that can provide in terms of the peak shavings or the smoothing type of things. And this also kind of area that the power shortages in northern region can be benefited as well. The current market doesn't have the kind of price incentives, therefore investment cannot be happen. Next slide, please. Then also the can invested in also for the ancillary services like providing the grid services such as frequency regulations or spinning reserves. This is one of the area also we found that in the Vietnamese power system, there needs this type of the fast responding grid services, frequency regulation services, is because of the renewable energy integration. We kind of lower the inertia of the overall power system. Therefore, conventional conventional power plants such as the gas or hydro are not fast enough to react to the any default made by sudden default made by renewable energy generator. So this is also a kind of area that we have to look into, and current regulation doesn't really incentivize the best investment to provide such the fast responding services, reserve services, or frequency regulation services. Current regulation says just to be use of the multi-purpose hydro for as a spinning reserves that's owned by the EVN, and actually their pricing is integrated with the PPA as a generator to receive. And then also the other cases like gas power plants or the gas turbine power plants that participate in the market, they also just compensated through the capacity payment. And both of them are not sufficient enough to justify the best investment. Next slide, please. What happens in the best market in other countries? There are several kind of, we have seen that kind of approaches in the various countries and organized this way. And one is actually regulatory asset approach, and the second is the market-based. Regulatory asset-based approach is basically the network operators is given the kind of allowance to or the permitted to invest in the best to provide the needed services to ensure the power system security and reliability. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be their responsibility to if there's any blackout or brownout, it's going to happen. Then so they're going to be the responsible bodies to ensure the power system reliability. And then this in the cases that basically investment can be done through the network operator, and then compensated through the tariff mechanisms. Either it's integrated the transmission tariff or the retail tariff. Market-based systems is basically use the arbitrage reserve contract or the arbitrage and reserve market mechanisms. Contract is because before the market is open, like Diana explained, basically the design of the market and reserve market and the service market will require a lot of actually the efforts and complexities. And the moment Vietnam doesn't have that kind of sophistications to reveal all the cost of the ancillary services into the pricing mechanism. Therefore, just start with the contract mechanisms first, and then moving to the market, and then basically through the pricing information from the ancillary services or the energy market can incentivize the investment in BESS. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is a kind of roadmap we propose to the Vietnam to start with some kind of pilot project in BESS to see really its performance and operation and values in providing the multiple services to deal with the challenges that I explained. And then I'm moving to the more incentive-based mechanisms that attract the private sector-led investment and the grid services, and both for the arbitrage as well as ancillary services. Next slide, please. Yes, in this way, that actually the investment can be recovered with these proper signals from the market, and maybe this is the way forward for the BESS to be in place in the power system to provide these grid services and to address those challenges that encountered by utilities at the moment. So this is the end of the presentation. Still, there's no BESS project connected to the grid systems in Vietnam. And we hope actually we can make some examples by using the regulatory asset approaches, which is actually having a contrast with the Philippines approach, where they really focus on the developing the market system, and it's going to be the long-term solution in the case of Vietnam, but has to be aligned in a way that start with also emergent investment to provide the flexibility resources through BESS, and also the coming from other also possible solutions such as demand responses. But this is going to be a journey to develop these needed standard and performance requirements for the BESS operator in the future, and therefore it's going to be useful to have these first regulatory asset approaches and to move to the market in the case of Vietnam. Okay, so I like to stop the presentation here. I don't know how much actually, it's kind of information being given to you to provide some of the contrast between maybe Philippines situation and Vietnam situation. I think commonly it has a kind of similar constraint in terms of the interconnections in a way. Philippines also have interconnection issues in the between the island system. Vietnam also, although it's not island, but still there's not fully integrated from the north to the south. And it's going to be the actual fundamental issues to really fully integrate the renewables and needs to be addressed. But at the same time, we need a multiple solutions that including the various technologies such as battery storage. So I'd like to open the floor for the Q&A a bit later on. So please save your questions unless I have questions from the app. Okay, so we have questions maybe for the Philippines cases. Maybe can we just do the questions, because maybe some of them waiting for the answers, and then yeah, okay. Okay, so the question is how much is the forecasted market value of the forthcoming FACS market in the Philippines?
Oh, so I think, if you're talking about the reserves market, it's going to be a stepwise process. Right now, we don't even have enough reserves capacity to meet the needs of the grid system. So one step might be forward contracting, but that doesn't prevent us from rolling out the reserves market as a sort of pilot basis. And we're going to learn by doing. So there's no expectation that when the reserves market is operational, hopefully very soon, that it would be meeting the needs of the grid. We will be learning while doing and coupling both long-term contracting with the market system.
Okay, second question is how will exactly Causer's pay approach will be implemented? How measure the contribution accurately?
Yeah, it's a good question about the Causer's pay principle in terms of allocating costs for ancillary services. So it's different for each type of service in terms of how it can be measured and who should be accountable for it. We're just working through this right now with the ERC on a test basis to identify how many data points are there that we could attribute the cause of an incident, say an outage, a lag in voltage, whatever it is. How difficult would that be to assess, hold that group accountable, and how would it affect the bills of everyday consumers? So we are working on it now with ERC. Once we have a set of recommendations, they'll take this out to generators as well as NGCP to discuss and do a full consultation. So I can't share the solution yet, but just that it is the goal of the government. We are supporting them on that, and we hope to have opportunities, even though it won't be for every single one of the service categories.
Hey, so what specific challenges and barriers need to be addressed in order to successfully integrate offshore wind into the essential grid service in the Philippines?
There are a lot of challenges for offshore wind, and fortunately the government is organizing between departments and it has a strong ambition to meet the need. So first and foremost is to ensure that transmission will be in place. The next is permitting. Again, it's an area that permits don't exist for yet. We don't have a seabed manager like the UK has, or other areas to lease offshore. So there's a lot of solutions needed in permitting, even for the regular permits that everyone knows, like ECC, environmental permitting and similar. All of the agencies need to update their own internal rules to account for offshore wind. We also need to make sure there's two opportunities. So one would be pre-development, in which maybe the permitting requirements are more limited, it's just studying, and then the full development, which will be quite different. Another piece we need is marine spatial planning. We don't yet have that in the Philippines. It's a critical component. Ports, that's enormous. We don't yet have the size or type of ports that are needed to support the size of facilities coming in. So emergency preparedness and response, the Coast Guard approach. There's a lot that needs to be sorted out, but I would say the good news is that there is organization and commitment at the top to work across agencies to make sure we're ready.
Okay, I hope it's address the questions from the floor. Maybe if I can may, ask questions for the offshore wind. Then with all this kind of preparation, when do you think we can see in reality in the Philippines?
Yeah, I think some of the most aggressive timelines are looking at 2028 earliest in terms of build. I do think that's very aggressive. There's a lot of unknowns, but we are here and we ADB are investing to make sure the government and the country is ready.
The scale of the offshore wind by the time, what do you think?
That is such a good question. So the DOE and the World Bank put out a roadmap that assessed the technical capacity for offshore wind in the Philippines, and they identified tens of gigawatts. I think 32 was one of the numbers put out on one of the scenarios. The Philippines grid itself is only about 26 gigawatts. So the scale of what's technically capable in the Philippines is more than double our current capacity. What's actually possible, it'll be phased, it'll be implemented over time, but I think it's probably quite a bit smaller than that.
Okay, thank you very much. Then also, if there's any questions on the Vietnam case, I can answer now. Otherwise, we move to next presentation, and we'll combine also Q&A again at the end. Yes, please.
Thank you. You mentioned that the drier and hotter weather has led to power failures, and right below you mentioned that if there was some limitation in terms of the water supply to hydropowers. So I was wondering if beside the water supply, the weather has actually led to other type of technological failures. And in this regard, the pumped storage versus the BESS, is there potentially a need for reevaluating the initial numbers that you provided under the light of those weather patterns? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we are now living in the era of the climate change and extreme climate weather we experience every year in different way. So it's going to be very hard, I guess, to forecast what is likely to happen based on the past data. But I think we have to be ready for the kind of various scenarios now. And then I think given these circumstances, indeed, the planners has to review and update the kind of feasibility. However, pump storage, despite this kind of uncertainty in the weathers, and then also lack of water issues likely in the future, whether it's going to happen, is it going to be whether recurrent issues, or it's going to be permanent issues or temporary issues. This is something that we have to, I think, examine carefully and then reflect to the model. But for now, in general, we think actually despite so, still the pump storage is going to be important and necessary technologies to place to really optimize use of the renewable. And battery storage is only for the maybe short-term kind of energy storage, but it's actually for the pump storage is needed to be days as well and even months. So therefore, it's going to be useful to have both of them in the power system. But still have there will be the risk, and different risk has to be reassessed, I guess. Yes, Ayato.
Thank you. One question, I guess, common challenge that was mentioned for both Philippines and Vietnam was around the challenges around the transmission. But I guess one potential advantage that Vietnam has is that it has borders with Laos or China, Cambodia. So I was wondering if you could let us know if there are any initiatives ongoing in terms of power trade or getting power from Laos, as Laos is said to be like the battery of Asia, Southeast Asia. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think this is very important. Also, one of the flexibility resources that country must have in this era of the energy transition. So in Vietnam, also they're increasingly import from China, and then also the Laos, and then also even Cambodia, they willing to is connected as well. So once you are connecting more and more, you can actually mobilize these flexible resources when it's needed. And we encourage these interconnections between the countries. And we have this Great Mekong Sub-region, ASEAN also power grid initiatives, and the regional power trade and market development initiative as well. So hopefully this could be the additional solution to the country's problems, which we're going to come to any countries who is going to experience this energy transition. Yes, Peter.
Hi, I'm Peter Dupont. I'm an ASEF groupie. Glad to be here. Nice to see you, Diana. So the question I have is in terms of meeting the variable demand and managing it through pump storage or BESS. What is Vietnam doing in terms of demand response? I mean, unfortunately, if looking at least the work we've done with the USAID SPP program, we've been looking at utilities, and utilities in the region don't appear to be doing sort of traditional DSM, focusing on more efficient equipment to slow the growth of demand, but there's a fair amount of demand response in the works. And I'm wondering how the planners in Vietnam, or how the advice that ADB is giving in terms of meeting peak demand through demand response.
Thank you very much for the question. This is a really important area because demand response could be the cheapest solution for the peak shaving. Instead of putting the battery, which is much more expensive, actually you could give the incentives to change the patterns of using the electricity, especially for the large industry users or the commercial users. So we've been working with them as well for the development of the demand response programs. What we found is basically there's a huge potential in terms of the demand response and programs in terms of providing incentives to the user to shift the use of the time for the productions, for example. And then also providing maybe the additional incentive in terms of the peak time and additional peak prices. Basically, you have a charge the highest prices for the peaking hours, then naturally users are kind of incentivized to change the times beside peak hours. Both actually has been studied and then also provided to Vietnamese government and energy sector policymakers and utility. They understand that the necessity values of the demand response problems. The major hurdles is because the kind of financing mechanism, the payment to the energy users is not kind of different from the setting up the, developing the electricity generation, solar power plants, or developing the electricity grid. Supply side kind of investment is well prescribed in terms of government regulations as a kind of eligible cost for the utilities to recover through the tariff. But this type of the demand side management, demand side options and payment to the users are not really recognized as eligible expenditures to recover through the tariff for the utilities. So therefore discouraging the investment. Yeah.
It's a really good question, Peter. In the Philippines, right now, when there's load shedding, consumers aren't compensated. It's just, it's a cost to people, to businesses. So we're looking at opportunities to include interruptible load programs in the categories of ancillary services. Now, the sort of opportunities are scale dependent. So you have opportunities for the transmission system operator to have automatic controls to shed certain loads, and those loads should be compensated as a service to the grid. Others have to be through the distribution utilities, and that's a different set of programs and different set of compensation, which our teams are not working on yet, but maybe one day in the future it's a critical piece, and we need to make sure that it's literally valued. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Then I'd like to move to the next presentation. So it's going to be Unashim regarding the Timor-Leste cases, and then we'll open the Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Hello. Very nice to meet you. And then thank you, Han-Jung, and then everyone for the session. What I would like to, my presentation is in 3 parts. First, I'd like to give a bit of a background of the project and why it's important to country of the Timor-Leste. The second part is the project itself and then how we are structuring it. And then the third part is that what we have given as a special consideration, because it's in the country of Timor-Leste, relatively less known to the other parts of the world, and then it's not credit rated. So to start with, next slide. Next, please. Yeah, just to give you a bit of a background about the Timor-Leste as a country, the population is 1.3 million. It's considered as a small island developing state by the ADB categorization. And also, maybe you have known that UN have assisted the country for 20 years to stabilize. It was occupied by the Portugal and then the Indonesia in the past. And it uses currency USD, because a lot of people ask what's the currency because of the power purchase agreement, whether that's indexed or the, what's the foreign currency in case they use non-USD. And then in terms of the credit rating, the Timor-Leste does not have any international credit rating. So it's kind of unknown to the world. Internally at ADB and OECD, they have a credit rating, which is relatively low, as you can see. Next, please. Okay, and then currently their source of generation is mostly diesel. And then one of the power plant can be used by heavy oil, but then however, because they don't have the storage facility, mostly exclusively all the generation facility, the 3 of them are run by diesel. So why is it so important to Timor-Leste, this project? Because they want to reduce the cost of the fuel, because every year the country is spending about 120 million of USD in order to purchase the feedstock. So by actually introducing this project, they can significantly reduce the exposure to the volatility of the diesel prices, as well as reducing the emission. And then also they can later, I'll introduce, but then they can think about the carbon credits, which can potentially generate additional income. Next slide, please. Yeah. So the energy, more than 75% of the Timor-Leste's oil import is just for the electricity sector. And then the operating cost is, occupying almost 90% of the cost is the fuel. And then just Timor-Leste, they only have a one electricity company, which is 100% state-owned. It used to be part of the Ministry of Public Works. However, they are now in the process of corporatizing, or actually has been corporatized. And then they are now actually showing separate balance sheet. However, the tariff is not at the cost recovery level, as in you can see in many other developing countries. Next, please. So about the project and how we are structuring it, the proposed project, we have identified about 3 sites to begin with, and then we were doing the site visits. In the end, what we came up with is the 72 megawatt, the solar power plant plus the battery. And then the battery, importantly, because we want to introduce a larger scale, utility scale solar, and then make sure that, it has some response in case a certain parts of the plant will be tripped, or, in the case of a night, so that it can be used to facilitate, reduce the consumption of the diesel power plant, the oil. So that there's some certain savings by introducing the battery into this project. And then the size has been estimated about the half of the solar size. And then I don't know how familiar you are with the OPPP, but the Office of a Public-Private Partnership, we typically provide a transaction advisory services to developing countries, member countries, sometimes at fee and then sometimes just as a grant. So that we have a scope of services typically running from anywhere from capacity building to defining what your projects are, and then what's the PPP, whether it's the right choices or not, and then actually supporting the country to tender the project. So in this case, we are supporting EDTL, the state-owned enterprise, to tender this particular project to the private sector. So the independent power producer will be introduced to the project, and then they will build, design, build, and then also finance the transaction, and then will operate, maintain. And then at the end of the power purchase agreement, they have an option to actually hand it over to the state at the zero price, or that the EDTL can request the decommissioning of the power plant. Oops, I'm sorry. I'm like not using the slide at all. Okay. So, okay. I've gone through that. Okay. Next, please. Yeah. So project location. So Manatuto is the site that we have identified. And then why did we choose it? Because it's number one, it's a public land, and then it's owned by the Ministry of Justice at the moment. So they have granted a right to the Ministry of Public Works to use this land. There's a special arrangement needed to be made. However, I'll explain a little bit later. But however, anyway, this is a public land, so no special land acquisition is required. And then it's a bit, there's a shore at the end of this land, but however, it's not like key biodiversity area, so that we can actually build a power plant around there. And then also the land that was provided to the to us, this site was the largest out of the all. Other parts was a smaller, or it was very rocky on the area, so that it requires an extra kind of civil works capex. So we actually didn't go for those lands. And then because of this area, although it's larger and then better suited for the power plant, this area is a bit hilly. So excluding those hilly areas, we think that, power plant that can be most accommodated is up to 85 megawatt. Next slide, please. So this is like the kind of design, the layout of the actual power plant. And then solar plant, you can see that it's laid out from kind of north south. And then there's a substation, and then transmission line. It's already existing. It's very short. It's close to the main road. And then the transmission line will be connecting to the main one, existing one. It will be constructed by the IPP, and then be handed over to the EDTL at a later stage. And then as you can see, the average annual fuel savings, we consider it to be 35 million liters per year. Hence, we're thinking maybe 20 million or so, the annual savings compared to what they're purchasing in terms of the fuel, which is 120. So that's the rate of the saving. Next slide, please. And then these are the kind of split roles between the IPP and then the EDTL. So main responsibility, anything related to construction, cost overrun, and then the performance of the power plant, either it's a solar or the BESS, it's all responsibility of the IPP. Whereas the EDTL, they need to make sure that the grid is working properly so that when it's connected and then so long as the power producer they're producing, they're supposed to purchase and then pay. Next slide, please. So in terms of the tariff structure, this is split into the solar. Solar is supposed to have a longer operating and then design life. Hence, it's a power purchase agreement is split into two parts, where the first part is we are paying, basically the government is paying for the solar over 25 years and then the 72 megawatt. And then it's depending on how much of the solar generation they are actually exporting through the grid to EDTL. And then whereas a BESS, it is actually capacity payment. And then it's not really related to the energy that's actually, what's the load shifting amount, etc. But rather it's a fixed amount. So why did we choose that? Because it's related to the functioning of the BESS, because we largely thought that whether it's a discharging or charging, it's in the control of the EDTL because it's largely used for the grid support, either the frequency control or the voltage control, etc. It's playing more of that role than the load shifting. And then it's not viable, as mentioned maybe in other examples that you can see, unless it's actually paid as a capacity. Not many people will be willing to actually fund this transaction. So in order to make it as a bankable project, we needed to introduce the capacity payment. In terms of next slide, the timetable, this is because the ongoing transaction. We have released the bid document back in February, and then there was a site visit conducted by all the bidders in March. And then the submission of the bids was by the June 5th. So we are now in the process of evaluating the qualification. And then there is a 3 envelope. So it's a single stage and 3 envelope process where the single envelope is comprised of the PQ, pre-qualification, eligibility criteria. Next one goes to the technical. Technical is pass or fail. And then the price is the last part. So price will be the net present value of both the solar and then the BESS combined. And then the lowest would win the bids. And then next slide, please. So what are the considerations that we have given for the project because it's in Timor-Leste? Relatively speaking, the country, again, is less known to other parts of the world. And then because it's not credit rated, typically the kind of the bidders that we attract are mainly kind of legacy countries, either Portugal or China, because they're just all over the places, and then Indonesia. Those are the typical kind of bidders they're looking at. And then it's quite limited, not too many bidders that come in. So we are glad that actually this was at utility scale so that, the large capex will be attracting some more bidders and then more competition. And then the other part of it is that the Ministry of Finance has offered to guarantee the payments of the EDTL. So in case the EDTL makes late payment or it's actually defaulting its obligations, payment obligations, then the Ministry of Finance will step in and then they will pay the IPP in order to make them whole. And what's the difficulty actually dealing with the, this kind of fragile country or the SIDS, is that the legal framework, sometimes it's really difficult to get a legal opinion. You have a very limited pool of the lawyers who can work with the international law firm, like the reputable law firms you can find for IPP. There are plenty of them for the international players, but when it comes to local, like you can only find maybe 1 or 2 reputable firms who can work with you. And then because they are kind of loaded with all the requests coming on from all the DFIs, you can see what the turnaround time will be. And then sometimes the interpretation of the law, there are different ways of doing it. And then just sometimes unclear, or there was a new procurement law that was just introduced this year. And then because it was the first time ever, they have actually introduced a lot of different things new. It was a kind of was a test and trial. And then we had to accommodate certain things in our PPA just to make sure that our interpretation, in case it's not correct, it will still have a backup. So this is like some of the consideration and then accommodation we had to provide for working with the Timor-Leste country setting. Next, please. So I want to talk about the carbon credit trading, what we're kind of doing in order to facilitate. There will be so most polluting sector in Timor-Leste is the waste waste management, and then the energy, because the energy because of diesel, and then the waste because they only have an open dump landfill, which actually OPPP also has advised, and then now converting to the sanitary landfill. In actually making the carbon credit, we wanted to make sure that we incentivize the private sector. They will be participating in the IPP, thinking there's an opportunity for them to actually harvest the carbon credits. So what we have facilitated is that we are going to give a 50% of ownership of the carbon credits to the IPP. But then because there is really no market at the moment, and then there will be no domestic market created in Timor-Leste. It's just too small to create in a domestic compliance market. So most likely it will be either traded in the voluntary international market at a lower price, because that's just how it's being traded at the moment. Or when under the Paris Agreement, there is a consideration to build the international compliance market. So once that's built, the country then can claim and then trade in the compliance market at a higher price. So that we actually thought that EDTL facilitating that trading on behalf of the IPP will probably get a better price. So that's why we had this arrangement. While it's a 50-50 ownership, EDTL will facilitate even for the IPP's portion of the carbon credits. So now we are in the discussion of providing this TA facility called Article 6 support facility. Basically, what we want to do is we want to set the framework for the Timor-Leste government to how to categorize the carbon farming projects differently across different sectors, because some of them can be from the forestry industry or like for the waste management sector. And then what are the kind of carbon credits that can actually export versus keep it for themselves? And then what are the requirements, etc.? Or how do you even monitor once the project there? You can use like Gold Vera, different voluntary market standards, but then are you introducing kind of additional monitoring mechanism in train because they only visit you maybe every 5 years or so? So those are some of the considerations that we are giving in creating this TOR for this TA. So if any other countries they require similar support, this is some area that we can think about as well. Next, please. Finally, so this is the kind of enabling environment for the renewable investment. What can you do actually to encourage the IPP to invest in your country? This was a bit of a tough question for me, actually, because other than the government typical support, like, MOF is standing behind you and then making sure that I owe you. And then, saying that I'll pay you regardless of, what my electricity company may have done, then this backup is very strong. What else can you provide, right? So this was one of the things that MOF has given, but on top of that, they're also considering this a special investment agreement, which would allow the land lease to be very nominal. Lease rate to be very nominal. So they have but then this is this has to be negotiated different directly between the company and then the government per se. Hence, we have not actually gotten to this stage yet, but then we have a path through in case this is not concluded. So in case the MOJ land can be leased to the private sector at a nominal cost, like $1 or something every year, then it's a great. But however, under the special investment agreement, if it's not going through or somehow this cost is much higher than what we have anticipated, then it will be a path through and then added on top of our solar tariff. The other thing that we have done is the ACLIF. It's the Asia Pacific Climate Finance Fund. So what it does is on top of a typical project financing that we come up with for the IPP project, there will be a special facility so that this is let's say, standby facility of a grant of 4 million or so that in case that, that there's a delay from the EDTL, this covers about 4 months of the worth of the PPA payments. So in addition to, let's say, debt service reserve account, which would be typically built under the project financing, you have additional support from the lender's perspective and then also from the sponsor's perspective that you can actually quickly draw on this fund in order to cover for your operating costs and then go through this cycle of generation, etc., until any disputed amount may be resolved in the meantime. So this is it for my presentation. Yep. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you, Una. Can you come up the stage, please? There's one question. How is the conflict history affected the development of the project?
I think that the conflict history, maybe not directly the project, but then I think it influences people in general. So I think yeah, people's maybe mentality or maybe in dealing with them. But I think mostly maybe it's more the capacity that the history is affecting them, because compared to the other countries, it's more difficult to find the qualified and skilled workers. And then even when there is a foreign investment, I think in the port project that they did in the country, they were not able to recruit as much as a local employees as they wanted. So it's not really having a particular direct impact on our project per se in the structuring, but I think when it comes down to like how can you contribute to the country by hiring more locals, I think it does that definitely affect.
Thank you. Any other questions for Donna's presentation? Can I ask how many bidders participated? If you can share. You said that there's a bit deadline is 5th of June. So I wonder, yes, how many bidders been participating?
Okay. So we have given about 3 months to prepare. And then I think, I know that there was like Indonesian companies requesting longer periods because there was I think, national holiday or so. But then because there's a political reason, I mean, there's a kind of election going on. And then, when the next administration comes in, they want to throw out all the project that the prior administration has done. So because of that, we would not give a more extension. And then we have received 5 bids, but then gladly not just limited to Indonesian and Chinese bidders, but also French companies with a joint venture with the Japanese Jordan company. So a little more diversity this time. Yeah.
Thank you. So hope to see this project materialized the end very soon. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Hi, hello. I just have a question about the carbon credits. Yeah. Have you considered it in the financial model, and how much is the price of credits assumed? And the second is the battery included in the computation of the carbon credits?
No, actually, the carbon credits, I mean, if we were actually structuring it for our own, then maybe that could have been a consideration, because then there's already a way of monetizing it. For example, there is an ADB facility which provides advanced payment for your carbon credits. So then in that case, you can kind of price in, and then maybe you can kind of adjust the prices so that what's the price, knowing that how much my carbon credits would cost, would generate in terms of my revenue. But however, for our bidders, that was not consideration. That was just a perk that they will get in the future as the carbon credits are generated. So that, that reduction is not reflected, in the investment. And then the BESS, no, I don't, so the solar is the one which is actually generating the carbon credits, but the BESS we are not considering for, yeah. Oh, I think depending on the compliance market and then the voluntary market, but voluntary market, I think it fluctuates, but anywhere, I think 5, 10 or something, I think it was. And then supposedly the compliance market, if it's sold, it was multiplier of like, maybe it could be like 60, 70, etc. Again, fluctuates, but then the comparison was a stark, so that we wanted to, if possible, wanted to get a, higher price. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Reski from WRI Indonesia. Picking up the question regarding the carbon credits, I'm just wondering whether the project is already additional. I mean, carbon credits need to be additional, need to be a high quality. How do you decide that it is eligible to generate the credits? Thank you very much.
I know that there are different rules. I think I'm not a carbon credit expert. So I actually wish that I brought my colleague here, but I think under the clean energy mechanism or something, there was a rule that I think your financing of your the project has to be in a certain way in order to be considered as a carbon credits. However, I think under the Paris Agreement that rule has changed, and then now I think additionality is that unless this is a nationally committed contribution, and then you are now additionally creating certain projects, then it will be additional. So for example, if I have already committed that I'm going to reduce the carbon emission in my generation sector by reducing the coal-fired power plants by a certain amount, or let's say 2%, that commitment, because it's already reflected, it's not something new or additional, so it won't be counted. But then because our renewable project is rather new, and then Timor-Leste government has never actually committed any targets for the NDC at the moment, so that this I think will be considered as additional.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this time's up. It's time to wrap up the session. I found these cases actually quite interesting, contrasting, different aspect in terms of how the country is now dealing with the challenges, opportunities to pursue the energy transition. And I hope it was useful to you as well. I think as Diana mentioned, it's good things to come. There are a lot of things actually is going to happen in the energy transition era, and for the carbon neutrality. And all of us actually has to be participating in this journey, both from the public as well as private sector. What's important is really government having a good policy, market and incentives and regulation in place in advance to minimize any kind of the challenges and additional costs to come to the economy and to people. So I think Philippines gives a very good examples how actually governments taking lead in terms of setting up this market mechanism, both for the offshore wind and the reserves and grid services. Vietnam also setting up the good targets and ambitious targets for the renewable energy, and then also the other storage technologies. How it's going to be issues, how it's going to be implemented, what is going to be used actually to attract the investment from the private sector, to be seen also in Vietnam. So hope we can share more in the next time. Also, the UNA's presentation was very good example when how the private sector can participate even in the small island settings and conflict situations, with a good kind of framework and incentives given from the international agencies like ADB. So I hope it can be a good example to replicate in the future as well. And I wish all the best to you. And thank you very much for your participation and attention. Thank you.